Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Corruption in South Africa has been identified as a fetter on economic growth and, unless dealt with effectively, could have devastating long-term consequences on government's ability to deliver basic services and grow confidence in the country's institutions. Joining me to discuss the impact of corruption on the South African economic trajectory is Corruption Watch Executive Director Dave Lewis. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking at an article that says South Africa has suffered a staggering outflow of about 185 billion rand in illegal money since 1994 due to corruption in both the private and the public sector. That's a staggering amount of money. And of course, this is in 2010. We are now in 2012. Is one able to quantify in economic terms or in financial terms the impact of corruption on South Africa's economic situation?
Not with a great degree of confidence in rands and cents terms. I've seen that figure used. A figure that's often used is a figure that the head of the asset forfeiture unit used a couple of years ago, that estimated that about 30 billion rands of our public procurement is wasted on corruption. There's been a figure that says South African corporates, it costs South African corporates about 100 billion rand a year in white-collar crime, which is obviously broader than corruption. There's a famous figure that says that corruption is the third largest industry in the world, valued at about $3 to $4 trillion. So, whatever figures you use, and they're not, as I say, easy to calculate, it's a large sort of rands and cents problem, and then arguably its indirect economic consequences and political economy consequences are as great as its rand and cent value.
Mm-hmm. What, in your mind, Dave, are the biggest drivers of corruption within the South African context?
Well, I think that there are a number. I think that the fact that corruption has not been seen to be punished sufficiently, whether that is through inefficient policing or, up until now, a sort of a less than zero tolerance attitude towards corruption, is not absolutely clear. But quite clearly, if you were inclined to be corrupt and you were doing the sort of risk-return calculus, you'd probably think it's a fair risk to take, given the vastness of the returns, and frankly, the scarce chance of being caught. So I think that's a major driver. I think inefficient institutions, poorly administered rules, as I say, a leadership that has been seen to be tolerant of corruption, and some believe, some stage involved in corruption. I mean, these I'm sure are all big, important drivers of corruption.
Mm-hmm. Now, people are often fond of, and rightly so, holding to account public officials who are found with their fingers in the till, or their hands in the cookie jar, to kind of roll out the cliches. But the reality is that for every corrupt politician, there's a business person willing to offer a bribe. To what extent is there a sanctioning of this culture of kind of under the table doing things within the kind of broader economic and business culture that allows for people to kind of oil the wheels, as it were?
No, I think that's right. I mean, corruption is often misconstrued as being concerned with the public sector. It's concerned with public resources, which is different, because the private sector deal with public resources as well. And you raise the example of tender corruption, which is arguably, in economic terms, the counts for the largest share of corruption. Certainly, for every corruptor, there's a corruptee, or whatever the appropriate term is. There's no doubt about that. There are some purely private sector offences that don't involve the public sector necessarily at all, that come very close to corruption, in the sense that they are conspiracies against the public, like price fixing, for example, is probably the classic private sector conduct that is corrupt. And then there are, of course, offences that the public sector institutions or representatives engage in that doesn't involve the private sector, where they simply abuse public resources for their own private gain, misuse public resources in some way or another, abuse public power. There needn't be a private sector player involved in it, but the point is that it's not about the private sector or about the public sector. It's about the abuse of public resources and public power. So the private sector is involved in it, and the private sector is indeed, guilty too of, for reputational reasons, wanting to sweep something under the carpet. This is not true of all firms, and I think that there's evidence that they're becoming less tolerant of it. One banker told me if somebody is found guilty of fraud or corruption in his bank, the bank's policy is to have the person arrested at his desk and taken out in handcuffs. Now, that's the sort of thing that should be done. But yes, I think that there is again a lack of enforcement on the part of business. And yes, business are directly involved in it by engaging in the corrupt practices that you've identified yourself. And so they're equally to blame for the situation.
Now, you're, of course, the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, which is a body that is dedicated to kind of shining the light on corruption. In the short period that you've now been in existence, Dave, what would you say, or at which sectors in our society is corruption, most concentrated, and are there particular reasons for this?
Yeah. This is not going to be very scientific because we've only been in existence for 7 months, and we rely, and our model relies on the public reporting corruption to us.
Whistleblower.
And we've had about 2,500 reports, about 1,500 of which are corruption related. They are all over the map. I mean, which is interesting. They firstly come from all parts of the country, and so anybody who thinks this is a suburban preoccupation, forget about it. I mean, it comes from areas. Particularly, those are the places where it's most evident to the population who is benefiting from corrupt practices. And then over the range of sectors, education and health seem to be fairly prominent, but so too are what are called petty corruption. Lots of complaints about traffic cops, home affairs officials, housing allocation lists. These are pretty prominent. Tender corruption and some very serious allegations there, pretty prominent. Nepotism in appointments, very prominent. And nepotism in appointments is often where the corruption starts, because somebody appoints his friend to be the manager of a little town in the Free State for a very particular reason. And it's often the beginning of corruption. And small town corruption in general seems very disturbingly preeminent in South Africa. So there's not a ready pattern, but the ones that have attracted our attention most are, as I say, particularly education, health, and small towns. But there are, a variety of other sectors and regions and places that are predominantly involved that are preeminently involved in
Now,
corruption.
earlier on, when we spoke about the key drivers, you said one of the key drivers is, of course, the fact that institutions appear to be weak and there appears to be a lack of, proper rules. We know that there's several agencies that deal with corruption in South Africa. We've got the Public Protector, we've got the SIU, you've got your asset forfeiture units, you've got a whole range of institutions. But are these institutions enough, and are we using them properly? And for example, the Public Protector is always complaining that she doesn't have enough resources, she doesn't have enough investigative capacity to actually get to the complaints that get to her office. From where you're sitting, Dave, and I know that it's early days yet, what are the kind of challenges within all of this kind of institutions that we see that's meant to be dealing with corruption? What is the weaknesses there? Should we not have a much more centralized way of dealing with the issue?
I'm aware, and I'm only really becoming aware, that there's a big debate about this, as in most things, about whether decentralization is better than centralization. In Kenya, where And the same goes for the tender procurement system. We also have a very fragmented tender procurement system. Would it be better if it were all in the hands of a single institution? And what if that institution became corrupted? So, there is an argument that says a proliferation of institutions is not a bad idea because it means that at least some will be operating effectively. I don't feel particularly on top of that debate at the moment. There is, and I don't know if your viewers are aware, this debate around the Hawks Bill, around the status of the anti-corruption unit, where the Constitutional Court has now decided that it's not sufficiently independent. And around that has sprung up a debate about, A, whether it should be independent, and B, whether there should be one single anti-corruption fighting unit. And I feel agnostic about that. I can see that there are certain units like the asset forfeiture unit that maybe have a very particular role to play. It may be right that a unit like that should remain independent, but I don't think it's the end of the debate for the centralisation versus decentralisation debate. About the tender rules, I feel very strongly at the moment that they should be at least made more uniform than they are.
Well, we've seen Treasury coming up with a series of rules saying that anything over 500,000 cannot, be signed off in the provincial government, should be signed off by Central Treasury. The big question, of course, is does Central Treasury have the capacity to oversee this? And is it necessarily a good thing for cooperative governance to take that powers away?
Exactly. The Treasury is a broadly trusted institution, and so it seems to offer a solution that Treasury should have oversight over as you say, procurement above a certain level. Is it appropriate that the Treasury should have such sway over health policy in effect, or education policy, or anything else for that matter? I think there's a debate to be had about that as well. So I'm sure that there are pros and cons of both systems, but at the moment, certainly where the tender system goes, I think that if there is not to be greater centralisation, and I can see arguments against that, then there certainly needs to be greater uniformity between the different tiers of government, because it seems to me, and we're just beginning to learn about this, like Byzantine or arcane systems, it seems to me that there is fragmentation not only of institutions but over modalities and rules, and I think that's not a good idea.
When I listened to the health minister recently, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, he was saying in the case of Limpopo, for example, the provincial health department would get a particular bill, but if you kind of unpack that bill in health, you would see that there was no invoicing. Say, for example, the bill comes to 90,000 or 90 million that has to be paid. The services delivered doesn't tally against that amount. There's no paperwork for it. How does it get to a stage where a department can't account for what it is paying for? Where is the accounting systems? In one instance, I think in Public Works, payments were made 8 times a month. So obviously a complete breakdown of the systems as it should be. How does that happen, and how does that continue to happen until there has to be intervention, from national level?
Well, I'm not sure that I understand about Public Works, because I thought, but I might be wrong, that Public Works is a national department and a national competence. Health and education, maybe health more particularly, are in a very difficult situation, because my understanding is that the ministry, the national ministry, is largely a policy ministry, and in fact all the spending and procurement and whatever happens at provincial level. So, there are provinces with vastly differing capacities. Where systems are understood better or worse, where checks on who is being employed. One of the really, I just say parenthetically, disturbing things you find is somebody fired as a senior official in Province X landing up in an equally senior position in Province Y, with apparently no dialogue that establishes that this person has been let go for corruption. So I don't understand why the systems are so bad. You know, there's a lot of talk about too many provinces. I'm not sure about that. But corruption thrives, there's no question about it. Corruption thrives on uncertain rules, unclear rules, unenforced rules. Corruption is about a parallel set of rules that are in place, parallel to the formal set of rules. And the situation, yeah, at provincial level is pretty dire. I mean, I think about 70% of our fiscus is spent in the second and third tier of government. So one has to get that right, but it's going to be an enormous uphill battle.
Mr. Lewis, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, we will continue our discussion with the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, Dave Lewis.